Although I didn't know Stuart Hall personally, I would like to begin with a personal story. My first encounter with the work of Stuart Hall was very coincidental. I had just transferred from the London Film Academy to the University of Kansas, and I was at the university bookstore trying to decide what laptop would best suit my student budget and my film editing needs. While waiting for assistance, I noticed a book whose title grabbed my attention. The book was Representations, Cultural Representations and Signifying Practices. At the time, I was an early undergraduate student pursuing a degree in film production, but the inner need to understand the politics of representation of Balkan cultures and societies, both locally and globally, felt pressing throughout my upbringing. After all, being born and raised in Macedonia, my childhood was marked by news images of the violent collapse of Yugoslavia. The evening children cartoons on the national television were often cut short with news about the conflict and graphic depictions of the unfolding war, which were often followed by panic and tears in my parents' faces as they were trying to establish a phone connection with their friends in Bosnia and Croatia. During my teenage years, the most widely circulated films in the region usually dealt with the political circumstances in ways that Slavoj Žižek famously described as a performance for the Western gaze. Indeed, I decided to study filmmaking in an effort to tell different stories about the Balkans and to use film as a tool for social change. So I flipped through the pages of what I later learned was an edited volume by renowned cultural theorist Stuart Hall. Read the brief description that the book deals with questions about meaning, about truth, knowledge, and power in representation, and I bought it. Not only I read it within a few days, but I also enrolled in a class on media theory where representations, along with encoding, decoding, was a required reading. Needless to say, my fellow film students couldn't understand why anyone in their right set of mind would replace a production course for some weird class on theory that requires so much reading and writing. Well, I'm happy I followed my instincts, and I greatly valued the early lesson that theory is not, or at least it shouldn't be, removed from cultural practices. Through Hall's work, I understood why images always have a range of meanings that are inevitably constructed through discourse. Since, as he would say, situational ideologies alter and transform signification, we need to dissect the ways in which ideology and power operate and how economics, culture, and politics render visuals meaningful. It finally made sense how the same photograph of prisoners was used both by Serbian and Croatian officials to advance their claims during the Yugoslav wars of the early 1990s. At last, my naive filmmaking dream to portray a better, more truthful story of the Balkans grew into something more tangible. Any experience with visual culture, regardless whether it is through production, consumption, or scholarship, is bound to struggle with interpretations between what Stuart Hall calls equally plausible, though sometimes competing and contesting, meanings and interpretations. In this interpretative arena, meaning is always a process of translation, which facilitates cultural communication while recognizing the persistence of difference and power between speakers within the same cultural circuits. Perhaps the best we can do is to never stop challenging dominant modes of looking, to always scrutinize the discursive thresholds that give rise to some meanings over the others, and to intervene in that discourse with richly theorized and contextualized empirical data. This all seems common sense today, but it was Hall who began challenging the hegemony of vision, and who made the case for a visuality from below that reveals how representations are linked to power and violence in real life. I owe to Stuart Hall my first entry into the academic space of cultural and communication, and my ongoing personal orientation to film practice as a complement to scholarly endeavors. Ever since the accidental encounter with Hall's work, his corpus of scholarship has been influential to my academic development. This is the reason why I was thrilled to take part in the panel. It would be an impossible mission to summarize the contributions of such an intellectually restless scholar like Stuart Hall in a 10-minute presentation. He expanded the scope of culture and politics by accounting for the power relations that exist in any society. His centrality to the development of the study of culture and communication, particularly popular culture and visual communication, audience studies, post-colonial identities, and race theory cannot be stated enough. As a young member of IAMCR, I'm also particularly happy that our association hosted a conference with a team on media and culture and a focus on national and cultural identities in 1976 with a plenary address by Hall himself, the same decade that is often described as the most provocative, productive, and heroic period in Hall's career. However, in interest of time, I would like to turn to what I personally believe is one of the key legacies of Stuart Hall: his firm commitment that scholarly contributions should be a critical intervention in public discourse, a commitment that finds deep resonance with IAMCR's mission, which I believe is highly inspiring for emerging scholars like myself. According to Hall, and I'm quoting, "An intellectual must work on two fronts. On the one hand, at the forefront of theoretical work, but the second aspect is also as crucial. That the organic intellectual cannot absolve him or herself from the responsibility of transmitting those ideas, that knowledge, to those who do not belong professionally in the intellectual class." Not surprisingly then, he thought of his teaching and pedagogy as a form of activism and constantly addressed different audiences in various media forms. In his own words, talking to ordinary people, to women, to Black students, in a non-academic setting, served some of my political aspirations. He took part in numerous social protests and spoke at length on public policy concerns. I remember an interview in which he challenged British xenophobia by stating that migration waves are inevitably implicated in military interventions that a country supports. Hall insisted that the theoretical and the political are a symbiotic space, and that theory should always reflect social and political reality. He was insistent that experience must be reflected upon. Quote, "To think about or to analyze the complexity of the real, the act or practice of thinking is required. And this necessitates the use of the power of abstraction and analysis, the formation of concepts with which to cut into the complexity of the real, in order to precisely reveal and bring to light relationships and structures which cannot be visible to the naked eye, and which can neither present nor authenticate themselves." End quote. And theory is formed through abstraction and analysis, but always for the sake of lived experiences, for the empirical conditions humans face. As Patty Scannell wrote, he hoped to avoid the barren polarities between theoreticism and empiricism of his time. He always strived to produce theories of the contemporaneous real. He decisively believed that movements provoke theoretical moments. Social movements call for the theoretical orientations that scrutinize struggle and resistance, two concepts so deeply engraved in his work. To unpack the matrix of ideology, power, and domination meant to understand how class-based, racial, gendered, and ethnic subjectivities are discursively formed and normalized within a society. He was writing in the peak of the civil rights movements, processes of decolonization, the Cold War, the rise of Thatcherism. Although a leftist thinker, he was always at unease with any political dogma of the time. He was as critical of Soviet socialist politics as of Western neoliberalism. He believed that, quote, culturally, we're in a moment of permanent revolution, end quote, which as scholars, we really have a crucial task to study. Hall claimed that to understand current political and social movements, we need a change in perspective or theoretical paradigm. He thought that since there are no absolute cultural breaks, however, new circumstances need to be examined by reconfiguring elements of the past in light of the unfolding present. To conclude, I believe that revisiting Hall's work in light of the political turbulences of our present, global uprisings, military interventions, civil unrest, economic austerities and growing inequalities, should remind us of the obligations we have as scholars and the rigor with which we need to approach the pressing issues of our times without being easily captivated by dominant technological, political, commercial, or ahistorical determinations. Thank you.